Such a pleasure to chat with you guys all today. I'm going to talk a little bit about like how to build and scale a multidisciplinary research team. I think a lot of times we in the UX world immediately think about UX research, but we have a lot of sister teams. You've got market research, competitive intelligence, corporate strategy teams, data science teams, CX analytics teams, voice of the customer teams. There's so many different teams in an organization whose like core objective is learning information, collecting and analyzing data, and really informing our overall product strategy. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about like how we can collaborate really effectively across those groups to bring together a really nuanced point of view that drives impact within your organization. I'll say so, like, kindly introduce me. My name is Nisreen McConkie. I work at PayPal. I joined them pretty recently, so just in March. I'm still like new and getting my sea legs a little bit. I lead our experience strategy research team, which is essentially our incubation team, as well as checkout, which is our core revenue driver. If you're ever interested in learning more about like PayPal, any of our open positions, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. But to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about like what I like to call our researcher's toolbox. Oftentimes, as you progress throughout your career, you're really focusing on building both like breadth and depth. If you think really about like the T-shaped model for career development, but over time, we also end up growing really comfortable with like our favorite tools, right? You tend to reach for the same method again and again, and like when your favorite tool is hammer, every research question looks like a nail. And that really limits our ability to be like truly creative in how we design and craft research studies and make sure that we're really applying like the right tool for the job. And so like a lot of times I find that working with other research teams challenges us to think differently about our own methodological approach and really like be creative in how we're exploring answering the research questions posed to us by the organization. I like this quote a lot. Like, if you've always done it that way, it's probably wrong. During my time at Rocket Mortgage, which is where I was before PayPal, and where I really invested a lot of time in developing like a truly multidisciplinary research team, we didn't originally start out that way, right? Like we were very separate, all laddered up into different parts of the org, but we started moving into the direction of creating one research team with multiple specialties because we saw the benefit of like connecting those dots across work streams, across relationships, and across business areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that story, as well as different strategies you can use, even if you don't all ladder up through the same org, to make sure that you're collaborating effectively and pushing the work forward. So when it comes to finding new tools, there's just different ways that you can like start this process of like understanding who these sister research teams in your organization are. The first is really to start with like shared operations. Like I find that a lot of times there's a little bit of like vulnerability and like opening up your backlog to another research team. There's like a concern of like, is this duplicative? Is this like, making it appear like that I don't have my own special skill set? There's just like a little bit of like discomfort there. So I find that there's a lot more comfort among researchers when you start with like the brass tacks of operations. We can always find efficiencies in how we operate. So start with processes, start with recruitment, start by like sharing panels, right? And then like work with what's really like well understood and documented in your organization, because that creates like a little bit of a safe space to start sharing our knowledge with each other without feeling like on guard or vulnerable. Over time, as you develop those relationships by mapping your operations and finding those efficiencies together, the next step is to really invest in like learning together, right? And like creating the safe space to learn about each other. Like, what are our core competencies? What makes me special as a UX researcher? What makes you special as a market researcher? Understanding what those core skill sets are, like the key to understanding like how we can collaborate and when to bring each other in at various points throughout like the research process. Over time, depending on like the makeup of your organization and your goals as a research team and where you are on your maturity journey, I think there's also like an optional third step, which is to create like a collective identity, right? Like to essentially build like ways of working that foster collaboration and inclusion, that make it like easy and organic to work together. But I'm going to start with the easy stuff. With the least vulnerable stuff, which is like shared operations. Jeff Bezos likes to say that we are stubborn on vision and we are flexible on details. The thing is, like, sharing operations not only leads to like efficiency and visibility across the org, what you'll find is it like also exposes what really matters to you. We build our operations with our unique goals in mind, our priorities, our values, our maturity, our vision. And by sharing your operations, you're kind of creating a lead in into those other meatier conversations to truly understand each other. So, like the way we approached this when I was at Rocket Mortgage was by developing a universal intake process. And by working together to create this, we really started jumpstarting that conversation about where our values overlap. How do we prioritize work? Where do the teams like align, and where do we diverge in like the way that we approach intake, right? And that conversation was really crucial in understanding how each of the research teams approached, prioritizing their work, communicating that prioritization, establishing deadlines, and etc. And that like really built a lot of empathy for each other and like the different pressures that we were each under and responding to. And that gave us a pathway through operations to better align on like what our values are going to be more collectively through this work. For example, like other than some of the core like logistical information, our research across included things like what do you want to learn? What do we already know? What decision will this research inform? And we had like a lot of debate about like whether those were the right questions. Like, are there too many questions? Like, how do we balance the information we need for kickoff from being like overly prescriptive? Like that conversation is very core to like how you orchestrate the research process. And by like learning from each other in this format and the creation of this artifact, we were able to like start that conversation where we could like truly empathize with where each other were at. um the other thing that we explored from a shared operations perspective was around like tooling and vendor management, right? And what's really interesting is like in the research industry, our like vendor and tooling landscape is pretty fragmented, right? Like you have like usability testing, which is usually, or sorry, user testing, which is usually used for like evaluative research, but you can do more exploratory work. A D-Scout is a little better at that. Like there's just a lot of overlap out in the world. By sharing like who we prefer to work with our sister research teams, we were also kind of revealing our preferred methods and approach in that way, which was really interesting. You'll find often too, like some market research teams operate like very vendor heavy, right? Leveraging a lot of outside agencies to field and execute studies so that they can take on a more like strategic and consultative role within the organization and spend a lot of time in like storytelling and like activation of insights. I found, like, at least in my personal experience, that UX research teams tend to take a much more DIY approach. They tend to do things a lot more in house, a lot more scrappy primary work. And so, like, the tooling that they leverage to execute on that work looks a little bit different. These are like two different philosophies about like how to approach like delivering research within an organization, and they're reflective of like different goals and maturity journeys, all right? So as we talk about like which tools we're going to share and which vendors we're going to share, we're also starting to facilitate a conversation about like what methods we tend to lean into and why, and how that like positions us strategically within the organization. Again, this is a very like safe lead in to a much more crucial meaty conversation about like how we're going to work together and where we're similar and where we're different. Another place where we really invested in like shared operations was in the development of a repository. Again, these are all things that we built out before we moved all of the different research specialties under a single leadership structure. We decided to all upload all of our work into the same place. And like the key thing here is like communication is a lot more than the final deliverable. If it was just about the final deliverable, we would use SharePoint and it would all be up there and like everyone can access it from one place. But it's really about like how we're delivering it, right? Like the format, the tone, the content, the intended audience. How do you search for this information and what sort of context? All of that, right? What we found by developing this research repository was that our market research and like experience measurement reports tended to be really long, really formal, very data heavy, lots of charts, right? our UX research reports were a bit more varied, but generally some of them were just like a fig jam, right? And annotations on a design because they were working to try to like deliver insights as fast as they possibly can. And this is just like a byproduct of the nature of the work and the research questions that you're taking on and like what your audience is most receptive to. But it served as a really good way to share how each team preferred to work and what sort of information they felt was most relevant to share when the study was complete, right? So again, you're talking about like the different business objectives that you're all working towards. When building out like the taxonomy for a research repository too, that was another chance for us to really understand how like each team approached their work very differently. Again, like our market research and experience measurement teams really organized the work by like line of business. It was very, very attached to the way that we considered our P&L, like our profit and loss and like cost structure within our business, while the UX research team organized their work really by like the customer, right? Like the end user or by like the product that they were supporting. And then ultimately we aligned on like a taxonomy that considered both of them and like the overlaps and the relationships between them. And I think it made all of us stronger because what it did, it forced the UX research team to think more about like the business objectives tied to the product development that they were supporting, the customers that they were advocating against. And it also exposed the market research and experience measurement teams to the products that could benefit from some of the more high altitude work that they were bringing to the table. So what this did is actually like facilitate more conversations of embedding each other's research into our day-to-day work with our product teams, eventually like really shoring up the way that we were integrating research across the organization. We were truly starting to cross-pollinate insights in a very like unique way. The last thing that I just want to touch on when it comes to communicating research is we also found that like different teams within our organization felt more or less comfortable providing like really a strong or like controversial points of view depending on like who their key stakeholders were. This gave everyone a really like a peek behind the curtain again of like some of the like corporate pressures we were each under and built empathy for that. So again, like it's just another way, like very safe way to start exploring like the underlying values, priorities, and pressures that each research team holds without having to tackle them head on in a way that can feel like really vulnerable when you're new to each other and haven't really developed like a trusting relationship. What I've found though is there's enough of that like underlying layer throughout talking about like building a shared operations framework that you're already on your way to developing the next step, which is really like that safe space to learn about each other and like also learn from each other. And like it comes back to just like being willing to being a beginner, right? And like start over and recognize that like no, we don't know everything. And no, one research specialty isn't any better than any other research specialty or more strategic or more impactful or any of those things. We all have an opportunity to learn from each other in different ways if the goal is to expand your skill set. Right. And also to bring more value to the teams that you support. You can always do more with more information. And so, like, the way that we started to approach this at Rocket was really to establish like core competencies for each of the different research specialties. We talked a little bit about like the skill sets that we thought were unique and distinctive to each specialty and what the overlaps were. And what we found was really there weren't a lot of differences in our methodology. I think a lot of times people immediately assume that like, okay, like market research teams have a different method than UX research teams and that's a different methodology than our competitive intelligence teams. But there's actually a lot of overlap in the way that we structure research and like approach like the methodology, like especially things like recruitment and stuff like that. But really the differences were for us at least were like the research questions we were answering and that was based on like where we were positioned within the organization. And so what we ended up doing is creating these like statements to like kind of define who everyone was. So market research was explores our markets and the audiences that drive them. In like one sentence, like that's how we defined our market research team. Measurement evaluated the evolution of our customer experiences over time. Design research deeply understands people, how they think, make decisions, and behave. And so like this really helped us articulate like who these teams are in a way that felt both unique and accurate. And then we decided to start breaking this down even further. And while this isn't something that we necessarily shared with our stakeholder groups, it was really good for internal alignment, so that as we came upon research questions that may be outside of our like immediate skill set, we knew which team to bring in with that core competency. So this is just an example of like what our market research competencies looks like at Rocket. And then, of course, we had our measurement competencies and design research as well. The other thing we started doing is developing like these sort of like feedback sessions. And this wasn't just like general feedback. We wanted to get into like the nitty gritty technical research, like data nerdiness of everything. And this is another way that you can start building empathy for others' work and like also like how it came to be. Because when you give feedback, something that naturally arises from that conversation is like what sort of constraints you were under when developing that sort of study. What sort of time constraints, what sort of stakeholder constraints, what sort of like political constraints. We all live in that sort of like corporate environment and have to take these things into account when crafting research. So like creating this like forum for that discourse like just increases everybody's comfort level and engaging with each other's work and finding opportunities to like collaborate and learn from each other. So like for example, we had a UX researcher that was testing a new landing page for a new offer coming to market, and when she presented her learning goals during a feedback session, it inspired the market researcher leading creative testing for that ad spot to incorporate new research questions into her study so that we could cross reference and like build a stronger, deeper understanding of how to go to market with this new offer. And we've seen this vice versa as well. Like the market research team, like would complete research that would inform like how we test the design, and like just having that discourse happen before we actually share the research was absolutely crucial in like changing our approach, that we were really inputs into each other's work streams. We also covered a lot of other topics in feedback sessions as well, everything from like survey weighting techniques to method selection to stakeholder management. There's a lot of skills that we share because in a lot of cases we use common methods. And so this is like a really good forum to start like facilitate that kind of conversation. The other thing we started doing were research hackathons, and we started by doing this like quarterly. Again, this was before we were one research team. We were all like operating under different leaders, but like we created a very like low stakes, fun environment for us to like practice and experiment with collaborating with each other. So by pairing team members like across like the different research disciplines together, everyone was like able to like think about ways that they can bring their unique skill set together. And like thought leaders on the team could also use this as an opportunity to like reinforce enforce like the importance of like collaboration and call out when it's done well and like reward people for doing it well. So it's a way to also like build a culture and like reinforce the positive elements of that culture so that we're truly collaborating. And that's something that like our leadership is very invested in making happen. So like I've been asked a lot in the past too, like what is a research hackathon? I don't think they're necessarily as common as like a product or design hackathon, but the way we organized it was that we had a really fun prompt, like YouTube for dogs or like something like that, like really ridiculous. And we would have a representative from each of the research teams. So in our case, that was UX research, market research, and experience measurement. And they were responsible for crafting a research study that leveraged all three of their unique skill sets to answer like the core research question or business problem that we posed to them. So we would have prompts that were like a little bit more in depth, but a little bit fun and completely unrelated to our project work. And like the outcome would be a research plan that you then present. Something else we thought was fun, that they had to present two pitches. One was a pitch to other researchers so that we can get into like the nitty gritty technical details of how they approached it. But they also had to present it to a group of designers, product managers, and business leaders who have no idea like what the technical details are. So that also helped us practice our storytelling skills both with each other as well as all the different stakeholder groups that we each supported, and making sure that we like were able to talk together about like how we share research with that sort of group, because that could be sensitive, at least for us in our organization. And it gave us a lot of practice in doing that together and being considerate of the needs of each of those stakeholder groups when bringing this sort of work forward. Um, the final step here to really like create like a multidisciplinary research team, or at least like bringing the disciplines together to collaborate more effectively, is to create like a sense of collective identity, ways of working, like an intentional culture that we can like build upon. It's like one thing to share what you do, it's quite another to define what's shared and like make that part of who you are. I love this quote of like, for good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, debate. This is the part that's the messiest, because this is the part where you're not talking about what makes you different and what the overlaps are and the efficiencies are. This is where you start talking about being one unit and acting that way. So it's an exercise that I found really helpful in starting to like facilitate this, especially when people have such distinct identities that develop separately from each other, is to do a mission statement workshop. By sharing that, like by building that shared mission statement, you're starting to define like who you like, the outcomes that you're driving for and what your goals are. And a shared goal and a shared sense of purpose can really unite you as a team because you're incentivized to achieve the same things. It also like facilitates a discussion about like what's important to you personally, right? When we ran this exercise at Rocket, we brainstormed individually, then in pairs, then in foursomes, and then we affinity mapped all of our ideas to decide like what sort of the team principles we really wanted to focus on the most. And we ultimately narrowed it down to curiosity, community, and pride. And like those principles defined how we continue to work together, both within our research team as well as across disciplines, just making sure that we were shared that same intentional culture, purpose, and goal. And so the mission statement we aligned on was that the Rocket research team applies empathy and scientific rigor to drive curiosity, ideation, direction, and confidence in business decisions. And so you can see there's a lot of different angles that we took to research and incorporated within this mission statement to be reflective of like the diversity of our teams and how they showed up to work. And like I mentioned before, the principles we aligned on are curiosity, community, and pride. And so, and you can see some of the more like sub areas there as well. But a lot of this was really focused on like leaning in together. And that was the core tenet of how we progressed forward. The other thing that we realized invested a lot of time in was like creating like a shared language. So I think that like by bringing your team's stories together, you're like simplifying what research means to the rest of the organization, right? You don't have independent research teams all trying to secure buy-in for their own work, all trying to get their point of view across separately. You get kind of like economies of scale by coming together, because like stakeholders no longer hearing different terms or different language from different people and having to relearn what it's like to work with research a million different times, because now we're all talking like a cohesive whole. We're telling our story together. And that can be incredibly powerful because our advocacy really like it'll start feeding upon itself, and all the research teams can benefit from one research team advocating for researchers' place in the process. That common narrative of like what research is and what it can do for an organization, it can take all of the research teams very far in their maturity journey. And by leaning on each other to tell that story together, we can get there faster and better. And then the last thing we invested a lot of time in was joint projects, right? We started actually co-leading research studies from beginning to end. And even though maybe one research specialty would lean in the first phase and then lean out or whatever, the idea was that we were framing and scoping and delivering the research together. And by bringing multiple research disciplines together to answer the same set of research questions, you can get a level deeper that you can activate more broadly. Because again, you're working with different stakeholder groups. So it gives you a chance to kind of like build bridges between all those stakeholders, ensure your product partners are talking to your marketing team, etc. And at the end of the day, like empathy is what brought us all together. And, as we think back to like our research toolbox, I could say, like, at the end of this journey, we could safely say that it was fuller than it was before. And like, it's not limited to our methods. Like, the entire process of bringing research disciplines closer together requires a lot of intention and purpose. It requires welcoming new ideas and leading with empathy. That's what brought us together just as much as any of the activities that got us to this point. So, what questions do you guys have for me?
So before we start questions, everyone take themselves off mute and let's give Nisreen a round of applause. That was great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you.
All right. I know there was a couple of questions. One of the questions was from me actually. How do you balance process and documentation with agility and flexibility in research ops?
Oh, that is such a good question. I love that question because it's so hard, right? Um, I was very, very lucky in my last role and in my current role to have a research operations team or lead that I can work with to help facilitate that. I think like if you don't have that in place and you're kind of like as a leadership team trying to build operations while making sure that the team continues to move quickly, I find that it's really helpful to scope out what needs to be documented and also like what sort of frameworks need to be developed operationally first to help the team the most. So like really understanding like where your team is at right now and like what they could benefit the most from, and then working on that first and like letting the rest of the work just continue, and then just holding yourself accountable to like developing these things over time is like the best way to go about it because you can't get it done all at once. So I know like when I joined PPAL, one of the first things we developed was the prioritization framework because something we were really struggling with was like bandwidth and intake and scoping studies. And so creating a prioritization framework and creating like a kickoff call document with a series of like questions that you can ask your stakeholders, like building those resources helped empower the team to like handle that part of the research process a lot more effectively. But I wasn't able to also work on a recruitment strategy at the same time or like something else at the same time. So I think it's just about like triaging those things and finding the space to do them one at a time.
Thanks, that's great. Yang, you had a question as well. You want to ask it?
Yeah, I was curious, as your teams grew and collaborated and then scaled, were any like hiccups that you experienced or like potentially pushback that you experienced along the way?
Yeah, I would say like you're definitely gonna hit pushback at various points. Like when we did ultimately make the decision to bring the research teams together, like not everyone was on board, right? Not everyone thought that was necessarily a good idea. Not enough people thought there was like enough similarities. I think that's the part where you have to like really lean in and develop like that personal relationship and like understand like what's driving that sentiment and leading with curiosity in your interpersonal relationships at work the same way that you lean into curiosity when you're developing your research. And I found that like that to be like very effective because a lot of times, like I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, like there's some vulnerabilities there. I think like especially with a lot of the layoffs happening in the tech industry right now, there's some concerns about like what happens if we like come together and then like people think we're all the same and I don't offer anything different, and like is that going to like lead to a change? Like there's just a lot of insecurities sometimes about that. Talking to people one-on-one to understand like what's driving their feelings is really essential to know like how to combat it, because you need to tackle the root cause and address it directly. If you just like try to ad hoc like tackle those symptoms, you're never really going to get to a place where there's true cohesion on that team.
It makes sense. Do you feel like, in your current or in your next iteration, as you are also scaling your teams, that you would want to, um, what is it? Start having those one-on-one conversations for people who may potentially have concerns so that it's a little bit more of a smoother process?
That's an interesting thought. Before we all came together as like one research team, it was certainly closer with like my sister research team's leadership as opposed to like their ICs. In hindsight, I think like you bring up a really good point, and I think like building up that like ground level relationship is really important. Um, yeah. Yeah, I think you're right in that. I think it's also tough though, like if you have a really large team to balance that out. So, like if you have 50 people reporting to you, it can be a lot harder to like invest in like having a personal relationship with everyone than if you have like 10 to 15 people reporting through you, right? As my team got larger, the way that I handled that is like I had monthlies with folks that were like indirects. I had quarterlies with folks from sister research teams. And then I had, of course, like weeklies with my own directs. And then we also created like two other things. Like one was like a thought leadership group. So we asked folks to raise their hand if they were interested in like supporting our maturity journey and providing feedback on our like leadership backlog to help like facilitate that. And so like whenever we had like new ideas as a leadership team of different things we can roll out or how we wanted to prioritize like the next phase of work, we would bring them in on a regular basis to provide feedback on that. And then we also had something that we collaborated with the design team on called the Rocket Council. And so this was 3 people that were elected by their teammates to like run retro sessions, to like host feedback sessions with the broader team, and like bring concerns up to our leadership team to solve together. And so like creating these sort of mechanisms, especially at scale, where you're like developing groups that are not always the same people, but are like cycled out on a regular basis to like provide feedback on things like culture and process, as well as your own like leadership team's like vision and backlog, I think is really crucial.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Mimi had a question. She says, what does the term maturity journey mean?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think like when I talk about like the maturity journey, I'm just thinking about like different research teams have various levels of impact at an organization. In some organizations, you're a researcher of one, and there's a ton of work to do, and you're just trying to choose the most impactful projects and handle what you can. Some research teams are 500 strong, 1,000 strong, and they have different sort of challenges due to their size. Do people have different levels of like operations and documentation, or different levels of access to tools and vendors? Like all of these things affect like how like quote unquote like mature you are as a research team and how much impact you can truly have on the organization. So when we say someone's like more low maturity, that means you have like a small scope of impact on the organization. If you're high maturity, you have a great impact. But like getting from point A to point B is very difficult, and it's not necessarily a straight line, and there's not necessarily a series of steps that always work. It's very unique to every organization and like what that organization values. So when I talk about like the maturity journey, I talk about like getting from that low maturity state to a high maturity state and all of the complications and challenges that that entails.
That's probably the best definition I've ever heard of that.
I'm glad to hear it.
Avery has a question. They ask, is there a research tool that you found to be most popular across your research teams?
Oh, that is a very good one. The one that everybody used without fail was Condense, which was our research repository tool. For folks who are very frustrated with Dovetail and its limitations, I can't recommend Condense enough. What's really great about it is like you don't just upload your research deliverable. You can also do all of your raw analysis in there as well. So they offer interview transcription, they offer like qualitative coding, and if you can build in a taxonomy in that analysis part of the tool, so that like usability issues or like clarity issues or whatever, and then you can search by that tag and find all of the data points across all of your studies that ladder up into that, which is like beautiful when you're trying to do like a meta-analysis and like synthesize data across all of these different things. So that was beautiful. We also use the express missions in DScout quite a bit across all of the different teams. So like an express mission in DScout, like you can get like a video response to a survey like question. So you would send it out to more than like the normal amount of people you would do for a qualitative study. We'd usually do it around like 40-ish people, but you're getting a little bit more depth by getting like a 60-second video response than you can get in like a traditional like survey open end. So it was a good way to get like a gut check on certain things where you need to go a little bit deeper than like a typical like basic survey would give you, but you like need to get like a larger, more representative sample. It was a really good way for us to like collect some feedback quickly to scope deeper work down the line. And so that was a tool that a lot of folks leveraged quite a bit to like facilitate that.
That sounds amazing. I had not heard of those tools, so I jotted them down. By the way, feel free, anyone on the chat, to you can put in the question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand. We've got the director of PayPal, so just saying. I have a billion questions, but I'll hold back. Give people a chance.
That condensed tool, because I had like a follow-up question too in terms of like having a repository, like baseline is always helpful, but how do you make it easy to search and find that you don't like inadvertently like miss over like a previous research study that could have been really critical to what you're doing right now? Because I found that ends up being the case like regularly for me, especially if I join a team that's had like research done over a while, where it's like, how do you consistently kind of like dig into the past research insights and like refresh it and make sure like those aren't forgotten so you don't redo similar
Yes.
needs. Yeah.
100%. So like I talked a little bit about like the analysis side of Condense. They also have like what they call like the stakeholder side that's only like accessible to like folks who are not researchers. And so like what's nice about that is like anything that you upload and like publish to that stakeholder repository, it searches through not just like the title and the tags that you assign it, but also all of the words within it. So if I uploaded like a PowerPoint deck and I was searching for like a brand health or whatever, any deck that mentioned brand health would come up in my search. You could also like change it, like use like advanced search terms like you would in Google, where you're looking for exact terms or like not this word, add this word. There are also a lot of like filters that are entirely customizable by you. So the filters we had were audience, line of business, product, were like the main ones that were used the most often. In some cases, if like the product is really well defined, we would also have the filter for the specific feature within it. So that helped our design system team quite a lot too, because like if we were, they could search for things that were like very data heavy pages versus very marketing heavy pages, and they could like get inspiration for like how they continue to develop their design system. So again, like building the taxonomy is the hardest part, like knowing like how do you want people to filter and find your stuff. And it was something that we had to update on a regular basis. Like it was no small task. I don't want it to seem like an easy thing, but like once it's up and running and you're more in maintenance mode, it's well worth the effort, or at least we found it to be.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Beth Williford. She asked, was it difficult to get support from the higher ups and from the different research teams to do the mission statement work? I thought the idea was so interesting, and I'm wondering if everyone was enthusiastic about it, or if you had to do some convincing for folks to see the value.
To be honest, I didn't really ask permission. I just did it. And this was like shortly after like the team made the decision to have all of the research specialties report up to me directly. I was the head of research when I was at Rocket at the time. And I was like, I didn't feel like, even though we had went through those previous stages to like continue to collaborate and like coming together, felt like a natural evolution of that. I felt like we weren't purposeful enough in how we talked about it amongst ourselves and made it central to like who we are. I think a lot of time, like the greatest failure I've seen from leadership in the past is assuming that culture is organic and like a good culture can come up naturally. I haven't found that to be true. I think you have to be very intentional as a leadership in developing the culture that you want to see and like reinforcing it and cultivating it and making sure it's like a bottom up approach. If I had come forward and said like, this is our mission statement, like y'all better get around this, like I don't think that would have worked, but by like creating a space for people to like have input into the final statements and also facilitating it in a way where we were building like those pairings and foursomes across the research specialties. So people were doing this activity with like new people that weren't part of their team before. That like kind of like forced us to have the hard conversation and really to align on like the things that really would bring us together. And so like, yeah, I would just like recommend sometimes you just got to do it. Not everything has to like get executive approval. I would say that like when I brought our mission statement and put it into like a vision deck and presented that up to my senior leadership team, so like after we had run these studies, they were very receptive to it. But I didn't go into like the nitty gritties of how I was going to do it with them at beforehand. I just kind of ran with it. And then we're like, look, this is where we align. This is who we are, and got their feedback at that point. I just just like personally, I'm a very bottom up person when it comes to leadership. Like I think like, like RICs are the lifeblood of every single research team. And like if you don't empower them and invest in them, like the rest of it is never gonna get legs. Yeah.
And Beth thanks you for a thoughtful response.
Thanks, Beth.
One question I had was if you could look back at Rocket Money, right?
Rocket companies. So
Rocket company,
yeah. So like the whole rocket.
Yeah, the whole rocket. What are some things you would do differently?
Oh gosh.
From like a research ops standpoint. Like or phrased another way, like what are some mistakes you would recommend people like what are some mistakes people should avoid?
Yeah, I think there were certain parts in my career at Rocket where I was overly reactive to like shifts in the organization. Rocket was a very like fly by the seats of your pants sort of culture. We moved quickly, we made decisions quickly, we pivoted quickly. Like I loved it. Like that's a very exciting place to be. But it's also like it can breed reactivity for someone like me who likes to be really on top of their shit. So like my own anxieties would sometimes come out and like that gets projected on the team. And there were times where I forced like a pivot for the team with more urgency than it really required. And like that just creates a little bit of like chaos for the team that was like, in hindsight, probably unnecessary. And so I think that like that's really what I would have changed the most, is to like be a little bit more thoughtful before responding. Like I think there's a way to respond thoughtfully and with urgency. And so that's something I reflected a lot on in my transition to PayPal, and is something that I've been really trying to do as I start like a new chapter here, is be like, look, I'm in another organization that like every organization has its reactive moments. How am I personally going to respond in that? And at the end of the day, I think like that's what it's all about. It's about like growing who you are and how you approach your work all the time. And so that's my like personal skill that I'm working to develop.
Oh, I love that answer. That's so interesting. And as you were saying, I was like, oh, you know what? I should take notes on that too.
It's so easy to be like so hyper reactive because like everything's got to be done yesterday, right? And so like it's a challenging place to be, and especially in research too. Like a lot of times, like I've definitely been in situations where like designer product is running with an idea, and it's not until they get feedback from their senior leadership team that they're like, maybe I should bring in the research team to like evaluate this. And then so you're like kind of like playing catch up. So like, like it can be challenging working in an environment like that, and easy to be reactive. Yeah.
Had a follow-up question to what you just said. But So have you ever had, okay, so sometimes I feel like off the record, like sometimes it's like senior leadership or C-level people will like chase a shiny new idea that they really want to pursue.
Totally.
And sometimes they don't listen to research, maybe insinuating that it's maybe not a great idea. Have you ever run into that?
All the time. All the time. Like, that's our lives. Like, I feel like I don't know. I don't know if a researcher who has not had that issue before. So like, here's the deal. Something that we developed again at like Rocket and we're starting to introduce at PayPal is like what I call an activation plan. So an activation plan is about like starting to plan out how you're going to activate your insights after they're delivered when you're still in the like framing and scoping process, like stage of the research process. And part of that is understanding who your core stakeholders are and like what their biases are, what assumptions are they making, what hypotheses do they have, what initiatives are they driving forward, what are they motivated by, what are they incentivized to do, right? That gives you an idea going in what the landmines are going to be when you deliver. And the importance of doing this really upfront, you can design your study to address those things. And that's exactly what I recommend doing is like, if you know there's going to be a really vocal senior leadership member with a preconceived bias, and you can work with your leadership team to like get some organizational awareness and understand what those implications are, finding ways to evaluate that specific hypothesis or assumption in your study gives you some rock solid evidence to go back to either like confirm it or refute it, right? Because it's really hard to argue with like someone directly saying like, no, I do not see value in this. You know what I mean? It's like, it's really hard to like push back against that. There are going to be times where like they still don't listen. I mean, that's part of the job, right? But like at least you know you've done the work to push that forward.
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions from anyone? Well, if no one else has any questions, Nisreen, how do we find you?
Oh, yeah, y'all can find me on LinkedIn. Let me grab my profile and put it in the chat so y'all have it. Give me 1 second. And then I can share my email with you guys as well if you ever wanted to hang out. I very, very recently joined AVP list, so you can find me there as well. But like I've got like no content there. I just so you're gonna go to that profile and be like, is this the right person? I promise it's me. It's just there's nothing there yet.
Awesome. Oh, quick question. How long was that UX research hackathon? Because I am obsessed with this idea.
The first time we did a full day with a lot of like fun breaks and activities in between, like a long lunch and like team building activities and stuff. And we made it like a all day, all us event. Once we got the hang of it, we did it for a half day after that. And we've done it both in person as well as remote. So we've done it both ways. I would recommend it the first time you do it in person because it's just like more comfortable connecting with people that way. We leveraged an on-site to do that. And then after that, we would do it like virtual because we weren't able to always travel everyone into the office.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, this was such a pleasure. And everyone, again, let's give a round of applause. You can do it through the emoji, you can do it through the camera, but we really appreciate Nisreen. Thank you so much. By the way, this recording will be up on our YouTube channel. So if you have not checked that out, here is the link to the YouTube channel. Yeah, look for that, and we'll see you next time. Nisreen and Yang, feel free to stick around, and I'll stop the recording.